Hello, greetings. So we're going to create two files by using the touch command inside the Unix xterm. So that'll create two files, and then we edit the files by using our favorite text editor. So we create the package with the Perl example as a package name, and then we call the useStrict pragma. The useStrict pragma allows us to use lexically typed variables inside the enclosing braces of any constructor or subroutine. So next, let me just explain what subnew is doing. So subnew is the constructor, and we are returning a blessed reference. The reference is in the context of a hash denoted by the curly braces, following by and proceeding next to the keyword bless. So the hash is actually what you call an associative array, in a sense. In the language of PHP, it's called an associative array, meaning it has a key and a value. So a key, you'd call the key, and you get the value based on the key. The next part of that line would be the $_bracket 0 bracket. It's basically indicating that we are working within the class, and that's basically the package name, so that we can call other methods from within this class by utilizing this particular constructor. All Perl classes have to have a constructor for object-oriented language. The next part is creating a hash called methods. It's really a kind of a reference hash, and we're defining strings by key value pairs. And mainly we just call this say and cup of tea, and we're pointing those keys into string values. We're creating our subroutines. One of them, the first one is called say, and again we use the my as the keyword to create declarative variables. Self is another way of saying the package name, meaning self itself. And args is another way of accepting data, incoming data from the external source. Args is actually a reference itself with more key value pairs. I'll show you how to access those key value pairs. So basically, when you call a method from an object, as detailed later, we can pass in arguments. The dispatch part is necessary for checking if a subroutine exists inside this particular class, or we're trying to create an action, and the action is going to be indicating how to print and format standard out based on the method that was called. So really we're kind of interacting with just dispatch rather than the individual methods. Later I'm going to describe, as the next part, on how to utilize a Perl module that does the same thing, but it's very shorthand. It's called Moose. Now we're creating our buffer call, action call, and what self is doing is saying, okay, we want the stuff inside the package followed by the action that was defined above. And there's always a default action. Say is the default action, so if there's no actions properly defined, we default to say. I'm going to reformat this so it actually looks better, so it's more readable. The idea is to make code readable so that people can go in and look at it and understand it, and then possibly debug it if it needs debugging or enhancement, feature additive enhancement. So we basically create our buffer, and then we return the action after we get the standard output. So we return a buff. basically on to the next part. We're going to populate our subroutines to perform the necessary string output and or manipulation. So here we assign the key value pair args. Lnum is the key, and we assign it to a variable, a scalar variable called Lnum, which is denoted by the my keyword. Anything that uses my is a variable that's stored in memory as a private variable and cannot be read outside the scope of sub say. So whatever's in the closing brackets is a privatized variable that exists in that memory until it goes out of scope. If you want global variables, you define things outside of scope. And you also use my. If you don't use my, an exception will be thrown and the script will not run. Here we use lines equals lnum. If lnum is defined, go ahead and manipulate the lnum string, a dash times a number, lnum. If lnum is not defined, then don't do anything at all. Now we're populating the message buffer. So these are just all buffers we're populating and doing different things to. So if lines is defined, if we got a lines, then go ahead and append a new line, appending message, or don't append a new line and lines and just use message as default. That's what the ternary operator does. And if the message doesn't contain an error, then go and append a new line. So let me see here. So we get this new line we're appending unless the message is error. So we're appending a new line to message if it doesn't have the beginning of an E followed by an R, followed by an R, followed by an O, followed by R, global, case insensitive. Now the next method is simply just populating a buffer with some string, pour some T, and then it returns that. It returns a buffer. Now we basically use a shorthand for self to do $_0. Or so basically we're saying like we were in the previous subroutines, but we're not interested in args. Here we define the Perl script. We define the user bin Perl followed by a pragma warning followed by a pragma strict. Warnings will print out any kind of warning, meaning if you are trying to access a variable that doesn't have any assignment. A created variable without an assignment, or if any type of warning with maybe duplicate lines, or these things that won't necessarily break the programming per se, but will just shoot out a warning exception. And it often doesn't crash, but it's good to have warnings because sometimes a program will behave in such a way that you don't really want it to behave improperly. So here we create the object to access the class that we just created called Perl example. We call the new constructor, so that creates our object, and then we define another variable called buff, which is our buffer, equals to the object dispatch, and then we indicate the method name that we're calling from within the class. Now, of course, the idea here is to get creative and tricky, and not to be too tricky so you confuse yourself, but just be creative, So if you call say as a method, then you just put a string here, and I just chose the string, the water is at a fast to boil, followed by a period at the end of the sentence, and then we followed by an lnum, which is part of the arguments inside the say method. Then we append the buffer to another dispatch method call. Again, I will emphasize using the Moose module if you're familiar with Moose. I'll come up with another video shortly on how to do this in Moose. That should be the second part. And then we call the method cup of tea here. Notice how we don't use line num. We're just calling it without line num, so we're not going to print any lines or do any formatting. We're just simply going to print it. And we're calling a method of say here without giving it a message. So there's no message. So here I define, I don't want to duplicate areas of constraint, so I'm just going to create a variable for lnum and then assign it at the top so it's very plain as day. We want to make the code readable. So then we print the buffer at the end with the new line, followed by the new line. That's what the Perl script is doing, is printing the standard output. And the standard output is shown in the console after you run the program. So in order to run the program, you have to do a chmod plus x Perl example.pl, and then try to run the Perl example, and we get some errors. We can't compile it because it can't find the subroutines. So I neglected to put the underscore inside the subroutine, so I'll go ahead and do that. I'll put the underscores because that's what we defined in our method. And then we notice that there's a formatting error, meaning that pour some t directly to the right of that, it's dash 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 and so forth. There's 40 dashes there. So what we have to do is go ahead and debug our program and find out what's going on, why it's presenting the dashes directly after the string rather than underneath. So we want to get away from doing in front of. It's a bad formatting. So let's go ahead and do that then. So what we got to do is go into our class and notice how the message cup of tea, pour some tea, doesn't have a new line at the end. So we'll go ahead and put that in there and rerun it, and here we go. Here's our formatting. Our formatting is nice, and then you notice at the end here we have error no more tea. This is because there's a default. This is the default here. So if we don't have a message, there's or a default message, and that's the default message here. I hope you had a good time watching my video. If there's some confusion, you can always download the code at the link in the description. The idea is to get creative, say in this particular instance here where we are utilizing the dispatch subroutine inside the class, the Perl example class. Say if we call a method that's not defined, we can actually spit out a warning that would say, this method is not there. In fact, it does spit out a warning. So if you run this and this subroutine doesn't exist, then it'll spit out a warning. Or it can default to something else, maybe a default subroutine, or it can do many other things that we can probably go into later as far as single method. This is just primarily single method dispatch. We can get into polymorphism as part of the Perl object-oriented code class. So polymorphism is a different way of doing things, but I present here single method dispatch. This is probably the easiest object-oriented style out there. So have a great day. Bye.